Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We have a very distinguished civil servant with us tonight, Dr. Ashni Singh. He has just finished 8 years as Minister of Finance in Guyana. And during his tenure, Guyana's economic growth was uninterrupted for the entire time that he was Minister of Finance. He is thoughtful, he is very careful and analytic in his work, and the benefits show off for his government. He also, and the reason that we've invited him back, he was here last year also, the reason we have invited him is that he has been one of the really unique champions in the entire Caribbean area for building a credible national monitoring and evaluation system. Guyana has been training people, building pilots, collecting data, learning how to do it right. And Dr. Singh has been the proponent of getting it right. He often would say are we doing it right? And the consequence was now that the government of Guyana and the people of Guyana are benefiting from a rather sophisticated monitoring and evaluation system. He has been the chair of the Board of Governors for the entire Caribbean Development Bank, the Commonwealth Ministerial Debt Sustainable Forum, and he also chaired the 2007 Commonwealth Finance Ministers meeting. He has a long and distinguished career in the public service. He has a PhD in accounting and finance from the University of Lancaster in the UK, and he is regarded throughout the Minister of Finance world as one of the really top analysts for being a minister. He thinks carefully about data, he uses it well, and he has brought tremendous benefits to his country of Guyana. I asked him to come and talk to us tonight about essentially why he has spent so much effort on M&E and what he sees as the benefits of it inside his nation. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm IPDET welcome to the former Minister of Finance in Guyana, Dr. Ashni Singh.
Thank you very much, Ray, for that very generous introduction. My great fear with such kind introductions is, of course, that they inevitably set up what is to follow the introduction as an anticlimax. And so while you were, of course, kind in introducing me so generously, I fear that I will inevitably disappoint with what is to come. But let me first of all thank you and Linda and the sponsors and organizers of IPDET for inviting me once again to join you. On the first occasion, it could have been an accident that you invited me. But having been here once, the fact that I got a repeat invitation does provide me with some degree of comfort. That is not necessarily intended to put you under any pressure for next year, mind you. But it really is a very great pleasure for me to be able to join this group of IPDET participants for various reasons. One, of course, the tremendous importance of the program that you've been participating in. Let me say at the onset that I have had the privilege of witnessing Ray Rist's work in this area firsthand, because he has been our lead advisor in Guyana over the last several years in developing a world-class M&E system in our country. And so I've been able to see Ray's work at close range, and he has run a series of mini IPDETs in Guyana, from which hundreds of Guyanese professionals have benefited across the entire public sector. We live in a world today beset by very severe fiscal constraints, no matter where in the world you come from. A world where the necessity to make very finite resources go further and have greater development impact is a compelling imperative. A world where no matter which institution we work in or which country we come from, we're under constant pressure to do more with less or to do more with what we have. I have faced this as a decision maker, as a policy maker in Guyana. I have no doubt that you have all faced this in your respective organizations, whether you are a national decision maker or indeed even if you manage a single unit within a particular organization in your government or in your the financial institution in which you work or indeed in the NGO in which you work. And so the reality is we are operating in a world where we do need to make every dollar have greater impact. I will spend a few minutes speaking about the Guyana experience, and I will then speak a few minutes, I will then spend the last few minutes addressing a couple of issues that I believe are peculiar to the development world, and in particular to developing countries, to leave them really as food for thought, because I know that so many of your participants, I'm told that about 65% of the participants of this year's cohort work in developing countries. So I will leave, and many of you, even those of you who don't work in developing countries today, will probably in your professional careers as M&E experts eventually find yourselves working in the developing world. Like I said, Ray has been helping us to develop a world-class M&E system and leading in particular the capacity building component, the human resources development component in building a results-based management framework in Guyana. But this work didn't start with Ray's entry into Guyana. There is, in fact, a history. And my brief remarks on the Guyanese experience will focus on that history, because we started from a point about 2 decades ago where Guyana was a new and emerging democracy. We had our first democratic elections in 1992 after 3 decades of undemocratic government. And with the restoration of democracy came the reality, or the discovery of the reality, that Guyana was essentially, for all practical purposes, bankrupt, that its physical infrastructure was in a state of complete and total dilapidation, that its social services were extremely poor and incapable of delivering to the people of Guyana, and that all of our key social indicators were below where they needed to be. Facing these realities, and indeed, like I said, the country was fiscally bankrupt. We were heavily indebted and incapable of servicing our debt. At that time, we were in fact spending 94% of fiscal revenues to service debt, which meant essentially that we were borrowing simply to pay wages. With that reality in mind, it was important for us to embark on a very significant restructuring process, essentially rebuilding government, rebuilding the country, and rebuilding the institutions of state. And we set about this task, like I said, 25 years ago, 23 years ago, or thereabouts. First of all, restoring the key institutions of democracy, a new and functioning parliament, an independent and functioning judiciary, the key democratic institutions like an elections commission, functioning independent elections commission, and so on. But then we recognized that notwithstanding these democratic prerequisites, the reality was that it would be necessary for us to have more efficient government. And so we set about rewriting the Constitution, and the story that I usually tell, particularly when Ray runs his mini IPDET workshops in Guyana, is a story that essentially starts with the rewriting of the new Constitution in 2001, because that, I believe, is a useful reference point to tell the story about the work that we have done to build a more effective government. And so we wrote, first of all, in the 2001 Constitution, a number of what we viewed would be the critical prerequisites to ensure an effective legislature, a parliament that would exercise effective scrutiny of the discharge of the executive functions of government. And so we wrote into the Constitution a number of innovative features, including things like standing sectoral committees of the Parliament that would discharge very sweeping oversight functions over the executive's discharge of its functions. And so the Constitution wrote in the creation of standing committees in things like economic services, social services, foreign relations, etc. Committees that were empowered to summon ministers and summon members of the executive and interrogate them and obtain testimony from them. And I've witnessed persons, including the Prime Minister, having to appear before these standing committees and provide testimony on matters of national importance. We rewrote our key fiscal legislation as well with a brand new organic budget law. We enacted in 2003 a law called the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. Incidentally, the passage of that act was in fact the last structural condition prior to our qualification for enhanced HIPC debt relief. And so the enactment of that legislation was part of the structural reform measures that we were implementing to qualify for debt relief under the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative implemented by the World Bank and the IMF. We enacted new accountability legislation in other areas, like a new Audit Act, new procurement legislation, essentially overhauling the entire fiscal management framework. Importantly, in the organic budget law, the new organic budget law, we wrote in explicit recognition of the importance of the performance basis for fiscal allocations. Because in that new organic budget law, we required for the first time a request for fiscal appropriations in the Parliament to be accompanied by what was described as a program performance statement. And so every single program that we took to Parliament to request financial appropriations for had for the first time to be accompanied by this program performance statement, identifying strategic objectives, key performance indicators, baseline data in relation to these key performance indicators, and indicating targets were the appropriations being sought be granted. And a lot of this, of course, would be familiar to you given the work that you'd now be doing on performance measurement. And so the new organic budget law made this an explicit requirement, introducing for the first time, like I said, a performance basis, a performance dimension to the national budget. The new organic budget law also explicitly situated the request for appropriations, the annual request for appropriations, in a multi-year framework for the first time. And so the budget that went to Parliament, notwithstanding it required and it sought annual appropriations, was situated in a multi-year framework. And so multi-year projections had to be included in the budget. Very importantly, the accompanying audit legislation gave the Auditor General for the first time an explicit mandate to conduct performance audits that would be called in other parts of the world value for money audits, or in some parts of the world comprehensive audits that focus on the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness with which a program or a government unit is being managed. And so the new audit legislation introduced this requirement of gave the Auditor General the mandate and the authority to perform these performance audits, value for money audits, along with the more traditional compliance and financial audits that the Auditor General would historically have been performing. That legislative range of prerequisites having been put in place, we then embarked on the institutional reforms that would be necessary, like preparing and implementing medium-term strategic plans for the key sectors. And so the more mature and better resourced sectors, the sectors like health and education, that had, of course, were not only better resourced fiscally, not only larger and operated in more mature planning environments, but that in fact had also external stimuli like the Millennium Development Goals that in fact set explicit quantitative targets for these sectors to achieve. We then prepared very comprehensive multi-year strategies for these sectors and started to implement them. And so that really formed the basis for this performance, the performance-based management revolution that we've been seeking to implement in Guyana. And that formed the basis for Ray's entry into Guyana. And so having put in place the legislative prerequisites, having put in place the institutional prerequisites, I should have said too that we did have to exert significant effort to put in place the data prerequisites, because just like every other developing country, there were very significant data constraints, and those of you who come from developing countries know the reality of scarcity of data. And so things like establishing statistical units in the key reporting ministries or in the key reporting sectors and resourcing those statistical units did take considerable effort, and in fact that work is still ongoing. And then, like I said, we developed this national M&E framework. We were able to get Ray, with the kind assistance of some of our key development partners, to come into Guyana and to help to develop, to now entrench the culture of monitoring and evaluation, develop the capacity. And so we now have a national framework for monitoring and evaluation built on this legislative framework, in relation to which I believe Ray has probably trained, you've probably trained, I think, Ray, now about 1,000 persons in Guyana, about 800 or so thereabouts. And in Guyana, that's a very significant number. Training professionals in, and these are all public sector professionals in strengthening the results-based framework, improving the quality of performance indicators, improving the quality of measurement, and all of the other aspects of a strong, mature monitoring and evaluation system. The result of this effort is that Guyana is now at a point where, not that the work is complete, Ray's work, in fact, and the sort of whole macro effort is still very much a work in progress. And I'd be the first to say that there's still considerable work to be done to get us to the point where we need to get to. But in the space of time that would have elapsed since we commenced that effort, bearing in mind that the constitutional reforms date back to 2001, we're now at a point where we are on course essentially to meeting or have met almost all of the MDGs. I think there's just one, MDG 5, in relation to maternal health, that is not yet met and that is under threat of not being met before the end of this year. But in relation to that, we've worked with the UNDP to develop, with the UN family of agencies, to develop an MDG acceleration framework, special accelerated interventions to achieve that particular MDG, even if not by the end of this year in the near term. We've restored Guyana to fiscal and debt sustainability. Our debt to GDP ratios are now comfortably within the norms that would be deemed sustainable by the international financial institutions. Our debt, I mentioned to you that 25 years ago, our debt service to fiscal revenue ratio was in the order of 94%. We now spend less than 10% of fiscal revenue servicing debt. And those, I don't see anybody in the room who I believe would be familiar with Guyana, but those of you who are familiar with Guyana, Ray has been coming to Guyana in the more recent years, would see the transformation that has been achieved over the years. Rebuilding of fiscal infrastructure, rebuilding of physical infrastructure, restoration of social services, and improving quality in social services and quality of outcomes and so on. And so that's essentially been the story of Guyana, and I'd be happy to take questions when we speak about it. I thought I'd like to spend, Ray, with your permission, I thought I'd like to spend a few minutes speaking about challenges that I identify as being peculiar to developing countries, and in particular to small developing countries, because I think they're a very peculiar set of challenges. And I notice now, Ray, in a lot of your work, that you include a section sometimes on peculiar challenges in introducing a world-class M&E system in developing countries. Because the truth is that you do have the gold standard of M&E systems, and we all aspire to the gold standard. But there are some very peculiar realities that obtain in environments, such as indeed the one from which I come, and I suspect the ones from which some of you might work as well. I'd say, first of all, in developing countries, countries like ours, the truth is that the need for a results-based management system, for strong M&E, is even greater than in the rest of the world. Because the truth is that countries like mine are typically countries with a much more severe fiscal challenge than the developed world. Notwithstanding that even in the major metropolises of the world, a very important fiscal choices are being made literally as we speak. The truth is that countries like mine, the fiscal constraint is a very severe one. And so the need to make every dollar of public sector revenue go further, or indeed not of public sector revenue only, even every dollar of official development assistance, the need to make every dollar go further and have the optimal development impact is an even greater one in the developing country context. So the first point I'd make is that there's an even greater need, I think, in environments such as you will find in the developing world. There's an even greater need for a strong results-based management system. Having said that, there are a number of peculiar challenges that you'll encounter. First of all, I would say that there's no point having this conversation unless there is political will and political commitment at the highest level. Because if there isn't political will, the truth is that there's only far that the technical conversation can take you. You can have a good, sound technical conversation about designing a good M&E system, but unless there's strong political will and commitment to migrate into a world of results-based management, to migrate into a world of results-based accountability, unless there's that commitment, the reality is I personally doubt that you'll get much further than a good, sound technical discussion. Thirdly, I'd say that we dismiss sometimes culture and cultural issues, but there is a very significant cultural reality that has to be confronted. And that is not just culture in the conventional sense, but there has to be, in designing an M&E system, particularly for any environment, there has to be due regard to ensuring the instilling of a culture of accountability, a culture of responsibility, a culture of measuring, a culture of monitoring, and a culture of holding accountable for performance. And that shouldn't be dismissed as something that we should assume exists in designing a world-class M&E system, because oftentimes it takes effort to inculcate, to cultivate that culture. Fourthly, I would say that in smaller, less mature bureaucratic environments, it's much easier for some of the rigidities of a formal results-based management system to be eroded. That's the reality. Because in smaller environments, the potential for rules to be applied flexibly, for interpretations to be applied liberally, the potential for relatedness, familiarity, proximity to infiltrate a rules-based system is much greater than a larger, more mature bureaucratic environment. That's a reality. And so taking that reality into account, I think, is an unavoidable necessity in designing an M&E system for small, developing environments. The truth is that the erosion of rigidity, and those are my words, the erosion of rigidity in smaller bureaucratic environments is not necessarily always a bad thing or a negative consequence or a consequence of negative things. The truth is that in a small environment, the capacity to absorb shocks is much lower, perhaps because the economy is much less diversified, is much smaller, is much less diffuse. And so oftentimes, rigidities have to be relaxed in order to respond to unanticipated circumstances. So how you factor those into writing a rules-based system that is going to be applied predictably and is going to be used for the purposes of accountability, I think is something that needs some reflection. And then I would say, finally, scaling your M&E system to suit the circumstances in which it is intended to fit. I say to people that I can't possibly spend more on measuring what I'm doing than I actually spend doing what I'm supposed to do. And so if I have an HIV/AIDS or a malaria or a tuberculosis program, I can't justify spending nearly as much monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of that program as I spend on, in fact, implementing the program. And this might sound like a trivial observation, but I don't think it's one that is to be dismissed. And I had to confront this reality when we were designing an M&E system, and I think I don't see my friend Frederick Martin here, but I know he comes at a later week, or he was here earlier. In one of the early rounds of discussions I had with Frederick, I remember saying to him that I understand that you can bring for me I have to be careful, I don't know what model of car would be an expensive car in Canada, so I should probably use a non-Canadian or non-American model. I should use a European model or something. So I remember saying, these are not the models that I used when I spoke with Frederick, but I will superimpose them for the purposes of making the illustration. I said to Frederick, I know you can give me the Lamborghini of M&E systems, but I don't want the Lamborghini of M&E systems if it's going to be parking in the garage forever. I'd prefer for you to give me the nice, modest Honda. Forgive me if I get the models wrong. I don't know cars too well. But I did say to him that I would much prefer a model that I can implement and justify implementing. Because the truth is, there's no point you designing the ultimate, perfect, world-class, gold standard system if I'm not going to be able to implement it realistically. And I say this because things like data capture, things like costing functions. In an environment like mine, the cost of achieving universal primary education is not a linear cost, because I have coastal communities, coastal urban communities, heavily populated, where the cost of a school is a very nice, easy, linear function. But then I have very remote hinterland communities that you have to fly 3 hours to in the middle of the jungle. And when you get there, you probably have 5 families with 10 primary school age children. But of course, I can't use remoteness as an excuse to exempt myself from the obligation of delivering universal primary education to those children. But of course, the cost function and the amplitude of cost of delivering a unit of primary education to children in a remote hinterland community, forest-based community, is very different from delivering the same unit of primary education to a coastal urban community. And so the complexities of costing and data analysis and estimating impact and estimating how best to spend the next dollar can get very complicated. And so doing this in an optimal fashion, you want to do it as well as possible, but I don't want to do it in a way that I end up spending more building the system to monitor and evaluate primary education than I'm spending buying books to put into the schools. Or in the case of the healthcare system, I can't justify spending more on M&E in the health sector than I spend on medicines in the public healthcare system. And so scaling, and by scaling I don't only mean amplitude. Scaling, I mean even in terms of designing complexity, degree of sophistication, I think is a very important consideration when working in fiscally challenged developing environments like the one from which I come. I'm going to stop there, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't see Ray tapping on his watch quite as yet, but I'd like to stop while I'm still ahead of the game. You've been an incredibly patient audience with me. I will stop now, but I'd be perfectly happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Is there anyone who would like to address a question to Ashni Singh? Sure. I don't know if we, oh yeah, there's a
Just out of curiosity, thank you very much. First of all, sir, your presentation just moved me. As I understand, or do I understand wrong, that this system all over is already could be called as up and running, and how long it took to establish it? That's question number one. And being a gender equality person, just out of curiosity, cannot keep myself from asking what's the gender parity and gender equality situation is in your countries. As you said, all MDGs but one are met. And whether you can say that there is gender parity in
Sure.
women's political participation, for example.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall I take the questions one at a time?
Could we take a couple?
That's fine, whichever you prefer, Ray.
Why don't you introduce yourself to the minister?
Thank you. My name is Khalid El-Harizi. I'm advisor to the Vice President Operations in IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development. I also appreciated, like I'm sure everybody here, your very clear statement, and I would have 10 questions to ask you. I will ask one.
Sure.
If political will is the key, can you shed some light on how that was produced? I suppose that when you had a new government, definitely new conditions were created, and I appreciated very much your equating result-based with rule-based, which I found was quite an insight there, monitoring system. But usually when a government goes, the constituency that was behind it is still around, the habits are still around, the culture, as you said rightly, are still around. So how that kind of chemistry, political chemistry, has occurred in Guyana?
Sure.
Perhaps we'll take one more back. Thank you. All the way back in the corner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. My name is Kamal Mas, UNDP Bangkok Regional Hub. You mentioned about the emphasis on the current system being on accountability. Results-based M&Es is also on the other side, the same coin is about learning and also learning from mistakes. I would like to hear whether and how sort of room has been made for learning, and especially from learning from mistakes, and especially for innovation within the current system. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. If I might, first of all, in relation to the length of time that it took, I suppose it depends on what my window of reference would be. If I were to start from the legislative work that we did, the new constitution was enacted in 2001. So that's quite a number of years. So it took we enacted the constitution in 2001. We enacted the key legislation after we achieved consensus in the parliament in 2003. And then we started the work that followed from there. The initial steps, like introducing program budgeting and so on, programmatizing the budget and introducing program budgets in the parliament, came probably about 3 or 4 years after the legislation was passed. But it's an ongoing process. Because even now, if you look at the budget documentation that we take to Parliament, of course, there is performance information, but there's always the potential to deepen and to strengthen that and to improve the quality of your indicators and broaden the range of those indicators and so on. So I really believe that this is a work in progress that will probably, I'm not sure that we will get to the point where we'll say we have perfected it and our work is done. I would say that from the time when we enacted a new constitution, it's been 15 years, which is quite some time, but I believe much has been achieved during the course of that time. Importantly, I think it required also a cultural reorientation, and that takes time. Just passing the law and putting in place a computer system and setting up a statistical unit, I think those are the easy things to do. Achieving the cultural migration, I think, is the bigger challenge, and that takes longer. You asked about gender equality and gender parity. I'm delighted to say to you that we in fact have done extremely well in relation to gender equality in Guyana. In fact, we have, I think rather uniquely, a requirement in this new constitution that every party competing in the national elections must have a minimum percentage of female candidates contesting in the elections. Now, of course, there's a big debate about affirmative action and whether such requirements should be imposed statutorily or not. But we do have very high degree of participation by women in the highest levels of decision making, including in parliament, including in the senior leadership of the administrative functions. I'm delighted to say that the party that I'm associated with fielded a female candidate for the prime ministerial position at the last elections. And so our cabinet reflects gender equality and so on. But very importantly, at the level of some of the MDG indicators, things like parity in educational attainment, we have in fact gone further than simply achieving them. Guyana is now in, I believe, the place of quite a number of developing countries where we have probably the opposite problem, because the males are now in fact underperforming in the education system. And so the challenge no longer is to ensure that girls have access to education and that girls do as well as boys, like at primary education, or even at levels of university education. We have now, in fact, the reverse challenge, underachievement by young males in our society. And I don't think Guyana is unique in this regard. I know that a number of other Caribbean countries face the same challenge. If you look at university graduates coming out, you wonder, where are our boys? They're not there. If you look at the top students achieving all of the passes at the school leaving examinations, girls, in fact, dominate. And so it's a challenge. Now the underperformance of young males, in fact, is a challenge of a slightly different nature that we're having to confront. I suppose it's still a gender parity issue, but a gender parity issue in a more from a more unconventional perspective. My friend from IFAD asked the question about political will. I will be frank with you. I mean, I could easily stand here and say to you, because we were the good people, that's why we did it. I mean, I could quite easily say that to you. There's probably a little bit of that. We probably were the good people. But the truth is that in our own circumstances, I think it was really almost the result. It was out of necessity, because we were in a situation where we had to manage better. And so, and we recognize this at the highest level of government, that we didn't have a choice but to manage better. And so we responded not by making irresponsible policy choices, not by making the short-term policy choices that sometimes are more popular. And the truth is, I think we've paid the political price for that sometimes. To manage responsibly from a fiscal perspective is not always popular politically. And I've had to face this reality even in the political contest. I've had to face the reality of my political competitors enjoying the luxury of promising that they will do everything under the sun. And I don't enjoy the luxury of being able to promise that I will do everything under the sun, because I will not make a promise that I can't deliver. And so we responded to this reality by making what I think were the right policy choices, the responsible policy choices. They were not always the right, they were not always the most popular political choices. And like I said, sometimes I believe we paid the political price for that. But I believe they were the choices that were right in the long-term interest of Guyana's development. I would like to think that democracy is a great leveler. And once we live in a democracy, I think even if not in the first cycle or the second cycle, I would like to think that the great leveler that democracy is ultimately the political will to make the right decisions will emerge. Sometimes it takes a good, charismatic leader to make it happen. Sometimes it takes the convergence of circumstances. It really varies from situation to situation. In our place, like I said, it was a combination of the restoration of democracy, the right political leadership at the time, and the existence of very testing circumstances that left us with very few alternatives. On the question that my friend to the right from the UNDP asked about accountability and the other side learning, you are absolutely correct that ultimately this is about achieving an optimal set of outcomes. And so that by definition means learning and refining through the various iterations. And we have found this, particularly given, like I said, we went through a process of developing medium-term strategic plans for the main sectors like education and health and so on. And so you discovered, well, we did go through a process as you implemented and learned and adjusted and implemented again and learned and adjusted. There was considerable, I would say, considerable emphasis on feedback on what worked and what did not work, and what worked more effectively and what didn't work more effectively. And so, for example, I used as an illustration this complexity about universal primary education in our unique, not unique, but our challenging geography. But that's a good example of learning what works. And so you might start from the inception that you have to provide a primary school place for every child in every village, but you soon discover, having endeavored to implement that that's not the optimal solution to achieve universal primary education. And so in the second iteration, you adjust your strategy and implement alternative solutions for achieving the same outcome. And so there was very significant emphasis on learning, and feedback into the policy-making function is very important. And so I agree with you. I agree with you that learning and refining and adjusting as you implement is absolutely important in ensuring that you get to the achievement of the optimal outcomes. Yes, sir. I see two persons at this table.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mudehi from Botswana. I would like to appreciate the performance reporting system in Guyana. And how often do ministries report? The amount of work that is put in that process, how long it takes, and who do these ministries report to? Number two question is on the planning process. I would like to appreciate your planning process and maybe the budgeting system. What kind of system do you follow? Do you follow a two-budget system, the recurrent and the capital budgeting system like other countries do? Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much. I want to join the previous speakers in congratulating our honorable speaker for the eloquent speech. I have a question, and it relates to the historical perspective that you have given us regarding, how your country started from, and considering that you were the finance minister, I was wondering what role would you have played, to exert much influence on the democratic process right from the drafting of the Constitution, as well as having all the necessary structures on the democratic front to be able to influence the kind of transformation that you have talked about, that also would have led to the M&E, system being implemented at the moment.
Sure.
Thank you.
Good evening. That's Ahmed from Egypt. Thank you for the nice presentation. I just have a question, which is, I think, too simple. The point of when you come to the ministry itself, I think there was a kind of plan before you came related to the Ministry of Finance. How did you cope with these plans, or you just start new era? And after you left now the ministry itself, is there any kind of institutionalization of what you did so far in the ministry right now, or once you go, your old plans also go with you?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. In relation to the question from the lady from Botswana, you asked about reporting. The reporting really happens at several levels. I suppose typical with any, as is the case with any typical reporting system. But I will say that there is, I would put perhaps at the pinnacle, at the apex of the reporting system is an annual reporting to Parliament. And so in the request for budget allocations for the new year, there is accompanying performance data that is submitted in relation to every government program. So that's an annual reporting mechanism that happens to the Parliament. So the Parliament can see that you got $1 billion last year, and this is what you achieved with it. You're asking now for $1.2 billion, and this is what you project you will be achieving with it. So that, I would say, perhaps is the apex, at the top of the reporting system. This is government reporting to Parliament on what was achieved with the appropriations that were granted the year before and what will be achieved with the appropriations that are being sought in the new year. There are, of course, other more detailed reporting obligations, including, of course, things like preparing of detailed annual reports by every ministry and every sector. And then within government, there are reporting mechanisms, ministries reporting to cabinet or subcommittees of cabinet. And then importantly, like I said, there is the external oversight by the Parliament, which discharges an almost ad hoc overseeing function, because the parliamentary committees that I mentioned earlier, which incidentally have rotating chairmanship, so they're chaired every year by a person from opposite sides of the House, they have the right to summon any minister and routinely summon ministers to be accountable to those committees and through those committees to the Parliament for the oversight, for the operations of their sector. So you've had the minister responsible for energy appear before the committee and have to provide testimony and documentation and answer questions in relation to the performance of his sector. But that is done on request, depending on the agenda and priorities of the parliamentarians who are members of that committee. The more entrenched reporting function is an annualized function, which is reporting every year along with the national budget. You ask about the budgeting process. We have, I think, a budget that is, we have a program-based budget, and I emphasize that because while we include performance information, we don't go the full extent. There are some jurisdictions that have fiscal allocations that are made in a formula-based system linked to performance data. We don't make requests for financial allocations that are tied on the basis of a formula linked to performance data. We simply have the performance data accompanying the request for appropriations. But our budget is very similar to the budgets that you would see in most British Commonwealth type jurisdictions. There's a recurrent budget and a capital budget, which we have worked to integrate more closely. So they're now more closely integrated in a single chart of accounts. And they're now, of course, part of the medium-term budget, medium-term expenditure frameworks or the medium-term budget projections for those sectors. But they're very similar to the kinds of budgets that you would find in British Commonwealth type jurisdictions. So it's the same appropriation structure that you'll find an appropriation bill by programs. And for each program, you have a recurrent budget, you have a capital budget, and now you have this program performance statement that accompanies the request for the appropriations. In relation to the question that my other friend at the same table asked in relation to what role the finance minister played, you are absolutely right that the finance minister does have an extremely important role to play, because the truth is, and I don't say that myself as a former finance minister, because a lot of this is about, the truth is a lot of this is about resource allocation and optimal allocation of scarce public fiscal resources. And so I believe that there's a very important role to be played by the finance minister in any jurisdiction, and that was certainly the case in ours, not only with respect to my own involvement, but I had the privilege of being preceded as finance minister. When I became finance minister, the president that appointed me was in fact a former finance minister himself, who was himself very integrally involved in the very early stages of the process. And so that helped, because there was a person as the head of government, with a recognition of the importance of things like fiscal discipline, and with a recognition of the important role that the finance ministry would have to play in achieving these reforms. So that was certainly helpful to have a predecessor serving as the president at the time. But I believe that given the role that the finance ministry plays in allocating fiscal resources, and I say to people, there's no shortage of roads that need to be done, or schools that need to be built, or hospitals that need to be built, or wage increases that need to be granted to public sector employees, or pensions. There's really no shortage of need, even in the wealthiest of jurisdictions. And so the reality is the finance ministry plays a very important role in allocating scarce fiscal resources across these competing needs, and therefore has automatically and necessarily a very strong vested interest in ensuring that resources are allocated in an optimal fashion, and that every dollar of resource allocated has the greatest impact. And so I agree with you that the finance ministry has a central role to play. But of course, for that to happen too, the finance minister has to be somebody with the kind of political authority that allows him or her to be able to champion these kind of reforms. I was lucky to be able to have the support of a cabinet that facilitated these reforms. I didn't by any stretch of the imagination do them on my own. I had an extremely supportive president and an extremely supportive set of colleagues in the cabinet. The question was asked in relation to institutionalizing the reforms and continuity. It's a very important question, because this really can't be about one government or one minister being in office. And so we have in fact placed an extremely strong emphasis on sustainability of all of these reforms, because I wouldn't want my legacy to be a series of reforms that would go when I go. Otherwise, I believe I would have failed. And so we have placed very strong emphasis on sustainability and on ensuring continuity. And so I'm not in government anymore, as you heard, but Ray would tell you that we have entrenched in the civil service this M&E program. The people who Ray has been training aren't politicians whose horizons are finite electoral cycles. The persons who Ray has been training are civil servants who, at every level, from technical, middle-level technical persons to very senior civil service levels. Ray has had cohorts of permanent secretaries in his programs that he's been running in Guyana. And so we've ensured that the efforts that we've made are deeply entrenched with the aim of ensuring their sustainability, their continuity beyond any particular government's term in office. It's my hope that that sustainability is realized. Of course, only time will tell. It is my hope that it is realized, but I believe that the required prerequisites to ensure sustainability, I believe that those prerequisites are there, are in place. But like I said, only time will tell. But it's a very important point, because you don't want these things to disappear when one government leaves and another, or one minister leaves and another person comes into office. I see Ray giving me the signal now. Thank you very much again for your patience.
We have two small, inexpensive gifts for the Minister of Finance. This should not be understood to be a bribe of any type, but just to show Ashni. The first is a rather interesting little technological deal that will be a battery
Oh, that's fantastic.
for you to keep your phone.
You must
This
have
man
seen-
has two phones.
You must have seen me on my phone.
I did see you in your phone. So
that's
here
very
is a
kind of you.
battery for your phones.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
And
Much
then here,
appreciated.
this is also not very expensive. This is the paperweight for IPDET for this year. You have one for last year,
Fantastic.
and now
I
you
do.
have one for
Lovely.
this year.
Lovely.
Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a rather unique evening. I mean, to sit in such informality with the Minister of Finance, to have such candor from him, such thoughtfulness, and to hear the thinking of a real champion, of someone who has understood his responsibility to be a change agent on behalf of his country. His country owes him a great deal. This man worked day and night, 24/7, which is why I always had to have two phones to be able to make the contributions. And the fact of non-interrupted economic growth during his entire tenure as a minister. There's not very many finance ministers anywhere in the world that you can point to who can say from the day he or she came into office until the day they left, uninterrupted economic growth. And given what we went through in the 2008, 9, 10, and 11 period, this man navigated his country in a very thoughtful and, as it turned out, a very beneficial way. I want to ask you, please, one more time, to give a very warm expression of thanks to Minister Singh for this incredible evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is part of the genius of IPDET, is that international leaders like Minister Singh will come and speak very thoughtfully, very honestly, and very candidly about what he faces and what he faced to make the change process happen in his country. It was a special evening.
Thank you.
We're honored to
Thank
have
you.
you.
My
We're
pleasure
absolutely
entirely. My
honored to
pleasure.
have you. Thank you.
very much.